Welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. We have been covering the Oregon Department of Corrections system. In Oregon state history, the death penalty has become law 4 times. On 2 occasions, it was voted out of practice by Oregon citizens and was once abolished by the Oregon Supreme Court. Male death row inmates are held at the Oregon State Pen, while women are held at the Coffee Creek facility. I don't have current statistics, but as of January 2019, there are said to be 30 inmates on death row, 29 men and 1 woman. There have been many violent disturbances within Oregon DOC over the years. On March 9, 1968, a day after State Governor Tom McCall had guided reporters through the Oregon State Pen to demonstrate how quiet the facility was and how staff had total control over the facility, over 700 prisoners rioted. They were able to take over several buildings and take guards as hostages, as well as other employees. They set many of these buildings on fire and vandalized much of the facility. 6 prisoners acted as a committee to air their grievances, I guess knowing that the press was covering all of this, and demanded better medical care and expanded work release program, and for OSP Warden Clarence Gladden to be removed. Warden Gladden was known as having a heavy hand against prisoners, and the facility was in serious disrepair. The takeover lasted until the next morning, when it was obvious that authorities were going to retake the facility. But the prisoners achieved their goals. All of their demands were met, and the warden and corrections chief, George Randall, were fired. The riot cost the state $1.6 million. As you can imagine, this event was very embarrassing to Governor McCall because he had just publicly praised the penitentiary staff and system as being one of the best in the nation. But it appears he had been misled by Oregon DOC staff. Security threat groups, often called gangs, have been a problem for many years within Oregon DOC. In 2011, OSP was placed on lockdown after a series of gang-related assaults. Approximately 100 inmates were later put into segregation or transferred to other prisons for their actions. In 2023, an inmate at Two Rivers Correctional Institution sued the department, alleging that he endured 4 prison assaults because the agency ignored his request to house him in protective custody away from active members of his former street gang. Inmate Michael Watts filed a lawsuit seeking $750,000 in damages. He alleges that he had warned Oregon DOC staff many times that he'd be attacked if he was housed with members of his former gang, the Norteños. In one instance, it is alleged that he was assaulted for about 5 minutes and stated that the individuals were allowed to assault him, which constituted staff misconduct. In another case, the state agreed to pay a former prisoner $135,000 to settle another civil rights complaint after a guard allowed other prisoners to enter his cell and beat him without consequence. This case occurred at the Oregon State Correctional Institute, the medium security prison I described earlier, located near Salem. He also stated that this assault lasted about 5 minutes. There were also at least 2 other lawsuits filed at OSCI by prisoners Ricky Hicks and Dustin Clark, who alleged they were also assaulted in their cells because a guard allowed prison gangs access to their cells. X stated that he was assaulted twice in his cells by members of the European Kindred prison gang in August 2020. X contends he was targeted because he was a dropout of the EK. Clark said he was assaulted in his cell in September 2020 in a similar manner. Inmate Michael Hagan was transferred to the Snake River Correctional Institution in July 2010, where he stated that inmate-on-inmate violence was prevalent, according to his court filing. Hagan stated that he had never been in prison before and attempted to stay out of trouble, to avoid conflict as much as possible, and refused to fight even when provoked. But in early 2011, a group of at least 8 white supremacist members targeted Hagan for retaliation since he refused to serve as the gang's tattoo artist. They also claimed that he was a snitch and states that his requests for rehousing were ignored by prison officials. Hagan reports that he had even reached out to black gang members of the Bloods and Crips to seek their protection, but they refused, citing prison politics that prohibited him from interfering with white prisoner politics. On February 2, 2012, a guard ordered Hagan to move into a cell with Terry Lepich, a known member of a white prison gang. I'm not sure if he was an EK, but that is the dominant white prison gang today in Oregon DOC. The lawsuit states that the guard did nothing when he heard Hagan scream as Lepich beat and stomped him till he was unconscious. He died the next day, and Lapich was charged with his murder. In these types of lawsuits, the words deliberate indifference is often mentioned as staff not doing their jobs and allowing violence to happen, which does occur. But as I always state, it is my experience that the vast majority of corrections staff are professionals. But you have that small percentage who are not, that are responsible for the majority of these incidents. It is also noted that a Snake River prisoner named Jason Gold was beaten to death by his cellie on June 28, 2013. And Oregon State Pen prisoner Joseph Atkins was strangled to death by his cellmate on August 17, 2013. Two Rivers Correctional Institution prisoner Shane Morris was killed by his cellie on January 27, 2014, and Damian Banks was murdered in his cell at Twin Rivers on February 5, 2014. But the homicides did not stop there. Terry Goodman, who was serving time for child neglect and drug-related charges, was beaten to death by a prisoner on December 11, 2014. And his mother also filed a lawsuit against prison officials. Due to these incidents, Oregon State Police launched several investigations into the Oregon Department of Corrections system. I've covered some of these gangs, including the EK, in a previous video. And the EK are also included in my books, History of the Aryan Brotherhood and Prison Gangs in America. 18th Street and Sureños are also very active within the system, as well as some Norteños, mentioned previously. And there are several Crips and Bloods, mainly from the Portland, Oregon area, that are housed within Oregon DOC that sometimes create problems. There are also outlaw bikers or one percenters that are housed within Oregon DOC, like members of the Gypsy Jokers. In May 2020, the Oregon State Pen was put on lockdown after inmates fought out in the yard, and a correction officer had to fire a warning shot to break up the conflict. Approximately 215 inmates, all from one housing block, were on the yard at the time. And afterwards, dozens of inmates were taken to disciplinary segregation, also known as the hole, where their movements and activities are strictly limited. Phones for inmates to make calls are located out on the recreation yard, so during lockdown, they are not able to call family or friends to let them know what's going on. In May 2024, a fight involving dozens of prisoners at Snake River prompted guards to fire back-to-back warning shots on the recreation yard, and that facility also went into lockdown. According to reports, nearly 240 men were out on 3 recreation yards when a fight broke out between 2 inmates and then spread to nearly 70 offenders. Today we have with us Dr. Karen Franke, and she was employed with Oregon DOC for about a dozen years. And we're going to talk to her about the Intensive Management Unit, or IMU. Inmates were placed there that ran into disciplinary problems or issues which got them placed in that confinement, which is a specialized portion of facilities. So, Karen, can you tell us a little bit, why did you decide to proceed with this specific study?
Well, when I talked with research before I began the study, I asked them if they had talked with inmates. They'd done some quantitative, but never qualitative, is what I was told. And so that's when I decided, hey, this would be a great thing to find out what are the inmates' view. It was a qualitative method used in that study, and I used a transcendental phenomenological design, which consisted of a face-to-face interview process using open-ended questions to gather the data. And I used that so I could explore and gain deep understanding of the program's effect on the inmates from their perspective.
And what were some of the typical or more common answers that you received from the inmates?
They felt that the program helped them, or that they didn't want to commit more offenses to go back there, but it wouldn't preclude them from doing so. And some believed that they had already made the decision to change before they ever went into the IMU program. They suffered psychological issues, they suffered mental issues, they suffered physical issues from the solitary confinement. It was like a supermax prison inside of a maximum prison. And so you weren't allowed out of your cell or have interaction with others on a daily basis, except for, just maybe if an officer or religious services or a counselor were to come to your cell. There was always that separation. Even if you had a visitor, there was no touching. You were very well secured.
So the IMU is a very controlled environment. A lot of inmates would call it the hole, but there's various reasons while they're in the home. Could be administrative segregation, protective custody, IMU. There's so many different people don't realize there's so many different custody levels in prisons
Yes.
and different units that are geared to deal with certain individuals in certain situations. So you were dealing with inmates in the IMU there and asking them questions. Then, so your conclusions, you already told me a little bit about that they had psychological issues. See if I got this correctly. Then you state that you found out that there was some temporary success in placing them in the IMU. However, long term, there was a lot of damage done. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, that was from each individual who participated. That is what they shared with me. They were still, even after being out 6 months, a year from the unit. And I only interviewed inmates that had completed the program and were back out in general population. And they shared that they still were suffering effects from being in solitary confinement for such a long time. It's a minimum of 7 months, at least it was during the time that I completed the study. And they said they would have flashbacks, maybe a sudden noise would cause them to jump. Some of them were not wanting to be around other people, they were less social. They just really wanted to be around family, didn't really want to be around other people because it was just too much stimuli. They offered some suggestions of what they felt that would help a person transition either from IMU back into being released from prison or going back into general populations, things that would help them to be more successful. They did offer that as well, the inmates did. Some of the suggestions that the inmates offered were de-escalation training for staff. So when there was an issue that they had, would be able to respond with tools to de-escalate the situation. More interaction with counselors, more interaction with staff of in the religious services, as well as the behavioral health staff. They were very positive about those staff and how they related to the people that were housed in IMU segregation. They asked for other diversions like maybe artwork, books to read, other things that would help them to be able to cope better while in isolation.
Well, that sounds very interesting. Yes, I think most people would agree. We don't want violence in jails and prisons. It happens frequently there. But yes, I think most of us would agree. We want them to stop the violence, but we don't want them to come out worse than they did when they went
Yes,
in.
yes,
Well, thank you for sharing that information with us today.
sure.
I really appreciate it. That it gives hopefully people a little bit more understanding that haven't worked in the business of how IMU works and how prisons work and how staff can either help become more successful or possibly make them worse.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you. That makes sense. I really appreciate that and thank you for all you do. In 2012, Deputy Director of Corrections Mitch Morrow threw out the old Oregon DLC Security Threat Group program and implemented a new Security Threat Management program to try and tame violence, extortion, and illegal drug trading and other crimes within facilities. He ordered staff to stop tracking gang members, and I remember that many of my friends in the department became very upset at that move at the time, and I can relate. Many times administrators at the King County Jail had little to no understanding of gangs, and they didn't care either. They would often cite recommendations by the National Institute of Corrections, the American Jail Association, American Correctional Association, and others to not negotiate with gangs, which I agree would only empower them. But this should not mean that staff should ignore their existence or activities. For years, Morrow reasoned investigation squads spent hours identifying gang members and tracking their rituals and enterprises, but dubbed them as being a sacred squirrel society. He saw little value in intelligence that wasn't shared with frontline staffers, and I agree. Unless it compromises an investigation, that information should be shared with staff. He said, let misconduct, not gang affiliations, drive the work. Indeed, since it is not illegal to be a gang member, I believe we should focus on behavior, but without properly identifying individuals and their associates, properly classifying and carefully tracking individual and group gang behaviors, you won't know who is who and if they're acting appropriately while in custody. 2017, a group of Oregon corrections staffers traveled to Norway to view their system, which are known to treat the incarcerated more humanely than most of those in the U.S. And they initiated many of those programs within Oregon DOC. Now, I've studied this philosophy in California, Washington, and now Oregon. California is ranked as the #1 state, spending more on corrections than education, and Oregon is #9. I agree. There's something wrong with those facts, which, in my professional opinion, do contribute to the schools to prison pipeline dynamic. Society has to deal with violent people, and I agree that oftentimes many people in prison don't need to be there, especially for low-level offenses or drug offenses. They should be in treatment or other more positive programs than just warehousing. In the same token, if we're too lenient with youth when they break the law, we can be creating an individual who may be a lifetime candidate for crime and institutionalization. We should be putting more money at the front end for preventing youth from ending up incarcerated, but also holding them accountable early on and teaching positive life skills, especially when they may not be getting those at home. Different subject, but I would love to see us focus more on bad parenting and child neglect and hold them accountable too. As I've stated in previous videos, I believe these life change classes and programs can work with some offenders, especially at lower level facilities. But these can also be manipulated and abused by more sophisticated offenders, many who are hardcore gang members and have no intention of changing. We must realize not all people are the same, nor are all criminal offenders. I believe we should always offer the opportunity for change, but also not be too naive and have a good system of rewards and punishments. To not do so only enables them to continue their life of crime and victimization of others. And with that, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.